Well, hi, everyone. A number of years ago, my then wife and I lived in a Southern California housing tract called Morning Sunwood. Now, Morning Sunwood, like many Southern California housing tracts, was surrounded by four-lane arterials. Morning Sunwood was bounded by 7-foot decorative block walls and the mid-70s ranch houses that were packed along the narrow streets and the cul-de-sacs were the closest we had ever gotten to middle class. And so Morning Sunwood was, well, very, very much a part of the everyday world. But one time, we found this wonderful, funny 1960s dresser on Craigslist because, well, we just loved mid-century. But when we got it home, we had to figure out what to do with that squat black particle board that had been in our bedroom for, I don't know, a decade at least. But we believed in recycling, and so we carried that old dresser through the house, stuck it out by the curb, slapped a free sign on it, which, frankly, the neighborhood association frowned on. But frankly, everything always disappeared. Now, later that night, about 11:30 or so, I let the dogs out back for one last turn around, decided to step out with them, and found my backyard just socked in with fog. I mean, by the time I'd walked halfway across the patio, the porch light was just this fuzzy smear, and I watched my dogs flickering in and out of the shadows like starships flickering in and out of warp, which gives you some idea what I'd been reading right then. But looking up, I saw that the city lights had stained the fog a kind of burnt orange halfway up the sky. And then looking down, I noticed that the hairs on my arms were covered in these perfect spheres of moisture that had precipitated out of the fog. I reached up to touch my hair. My hands came away wet. I brushed my beard. Water actually ran down the front of my shirt. And looking down again, I discovered that I was completely covered in those perfect spherical jewels. They were reflecting the light from a nearby bedroom window, and looking at all that treasure, I thought to myself, holy crap! That particle board dresser is out in all of this. By morning, it'll be warped. Nobody will carry it away, and I'll have to figure out how to bust it up and feed it into the garbage over the next 3 or 4 weeks. And so I ran back through the house, grabbed a couple of dog towels and a roll of plastic we'd been using to do some painting right then, stepped out onto my front porch, and just stopped dead. There was no time at which my Southern California suburban housing tract was more beautiful than when it was totally socked in with fog. I mean, you could just see the outline of the blocky houses against that burnt orange stain. And even the street light out in front of the house was just this fuzzy cone of light, like like a force field in a cheap sci-fi movie. As a matter of fact, halfway down the block was another fuzzy cone of light, and beyond that, a third, as if the neighborhood association had finally decided to establish those teleportation stations for our convenience. And I really began to feel like I was in somebody else's cheap sci-fi movie. But I started off the porch, but right then, one of my neighbors turned in their driveway a couple of houses down, so I stepped back into the shadows. I didn't really want to have to explain what I was doing at midnight in front of my house, drying a dresser. And so I stood in the shadows, and they sat in their SUV, and I continued to sit in the shadows, and they continued to sit in their car until when they finally got out. The sound of that door opening, that snick, jumped into the air all around my head. There was something about the moisture in the air that made every sound sharp and distinct. And I watched them walk toward the back of the car, and then the hatch on that SUV opened on its own. It went just like the hatch on the Star Trek shuttle. And then I watched them gather their late night groceries into their arms, head for their porch, and the hatch went. And their shadows from their porch lights flickered across the back of those car windows, shifting in insubstantial aliens from, I don't know, retro planet X75. But when they finally went inside, I headed for the curb. I dropped the plastic on the sidewalk, grabbed up the first towel, and I began to soak up all of the water that had collected across the top of that particle board dresser. Apparently, I guess the surface tension in the water held a layer of moisture entirely across the top of that dresser, which is not good for particle board, no matter what universe you happen to be living in. But about the time the first towel got soaked, I began to hear it was the sound of tennis shoes on damp pavement. And I looked up, and halfway down the block at that second cone of light, someone was running down the middle of the street as hard as they could go, backwards. And when they entered that second cone of light, the sound of their tennis shoes leaped into the air all around my head. And as they left that second teleportation station, their footsteps faded. And I waited, damp towel in hand, wondering, I guess, what might happen next. When there he was at my teleportation station. He was this young Asian guy in shorts and a yellow windbreaker, and he was running down the middle of my cul-de-sac as hard as he could go, backwards. And when he got to the end of our circle, he stopped and bent over, trying to catch his breath. He was maybe, I don't know, 12 feet away on the other side of that fuzzy cone of light, and he didn't look at me, and he didn't speak to me, but, well, he had been running down the street backwards at midnight, and there I was, 12 feet away, and I didn't say anything because I had been drying a dresser at midnight. I'm just saying. And after 2 really awkward minutes, he finally caught his breath, dropped into a crouch, set his feet against the curb as if it was a starter's block, and then he leaped forward, this time through my faux teleportation station, and he disappeared out into the darkness. And I waited, been here before, when there he was at the second teleportation station. And as he left that cone of light, I swear to God, he flickered, and his footsteps faded. And he never stopped running, but he never reached that third cone of light. I mean, he had disappeared as surely as we knew that dresser would disappear by morning. But I waited, just in case, and finally dropped the damp towel, grabbed up the second, finished drying the dresser, flipped the plastic over it, and tucked it underneath the feet so it wouldn't blow away overnight. gathered everything else up into my arms, started up the sidewalk and onto the porch of the mothership. And the hatch went and I walked in to my kitchen, where I could hear the dogs whining at the back door to be let in. And when I pushed the slider open for them, they flickered out of the darkness like starships flickering out of warp, and every hair on their body was crowned with these perfect spheres of moisture that had precipitated out of the fog. They were glistening in the bright yellow light at the kitchen, and then, being dogs, they shook, and every perfect jewel rocketed away in every direction toward every surface in the kitchen, including me, and I flinched. But the air in the kitchen was so dry that each of those perfect spheres evaporated into warp before they could reach me. And looking around, I was home again, and the sound of their flapping ears was very, very much a part of the everyday world. That's right.